Welcome to more insipid mansplaining. The John Birch Society has been warning for years that for America to regain its bearings, it would have to reestablish the Constitution and the original power dynamics forged in that document. For the last 100 years, however, everything has been off kilter. The Arabs have an expression: whoever accepts the silver is the servant, meaning if you're the one doling out the cash, you have the power. That was the original relationship between the states and the feds. The states funded the feds, hence the states were in charge. This was short-circuited, however, when Alexander Hamilton violated the Constitution and set up the First National Bank of the United States in 1791. As Thomas Jefferson pointed out, there was no constitutional authority to do this. Nevertheless, Hamilton used his influence, and the support of the Bank of England, to ram this institution through. 80% of its stock was owned by foreigners, most of whom were in the City of London. Hamilton was their agent in the United States. Eventually the people saw through it, and after the 20-year charter ran out, it was not renewed. European financial interests weren't going to take this lying down. When the bank's charter ran out in 1811, they launched a war against America, now known as the War of 1812. By 1816, they had installed a second national bank of the United States. Americans were infuriated. This gave the European financial system control over America. Luckily, Andrew Jackson had it removed, gaining the distinction of being the only president in history who presided over a debt-free America. He freed us until the Federal Reserve came in 1913, and a third central bank was established. And this gets back to what I was saying before. Whoever pays out the silver is the master. According to how the system was supposed to work, if the government needed money to do something, they had to get it from the citizens in the form of taxes. Build a new canal, construct new bridges and roadways. That was supposed to be financed by the citizens. This puts the citizen in charge, and if they don't like the charges, they can fire the politician and get a new one. They had the control. By establishing a central bank, now the government goes to them for loans rather than to the citizens. And the bank is happy to do this because they get interest on the loans. The politicians are happy to do this because they can get funds without having to raise taxes and risk getting voted out. See here.
A number of years ago, the Central Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, produced a document entitled Modern Money Mechanics. This publication detailed the institutionalized practice of money creation as utilized by the Federal Reserve and the web of global commercial banks it supports. On the opening page, the document states its objective. The purpose of this booklet is to describe the basic process of money creation in a fractional reserve banking system. It then proceeds to describe this fractional reserve process through various banking terminology, a translation of which goes something like this. The United States government decides it needs some money, so it calls up the Federal Reserve and requests, say, $10 billion. The Fed replies, saying, sure, we'll buy $10 billion in government bonds from you. So the government takes some pieces of paper, paints some official-looking designs on them, and calls them treasury bonds. Then it puts a value on these bonds to the sum of $10 billion and sends them over to the Fed. In turn, the people at the Fed draw up a bunch of impressive pieces of paper themselves, only this time calling them Federal Reserve notes, also designating a value of $10 billion to the set. The Fed then takes these notes and trades them for the bonds. Once this exchange is complete, the government then takes the $10 billion in Federal Reserve notes and deposits it into a bank account. And upon this deposit, the paper notes officially become legal tender money, adding $10 billion to the U.S. money supply. And there it is. $10 billion in new money has been created. Of course, this example is a generalization, for, in reality, this transaction would occur electronically, with no paper used at all. In fact, only 3% of the U.S. money supply exists in physical currency. The other 97% essentially exists in computers alone. Now, government bonds are, by design, instruments of debt. And when the Fed purchases these bonds, with money it essentially created out of thin air, the government is actually promising to pay back that money to the Fed. In other words, the money was created out of debt. This mind-numbing paradox of how money or value can be created out of debt or a liability will become more clear as we further this exercise.
Because the politicians raised money from the banks rather than from the citizens, interest now has to be paid on it. If they had raised it in taxes, a new roadway might cost $1 billion, but by borrowing it from the banks, it now costs $1.4 billion, that extra $400 million being paid to the banks in interest. So that road is more expensive than had it been financed constitutionally. But worse than the waste of money is the power shift away from the citizens controlling the purse strings to a foreign banking cartel controlling the purse strings. Our government is now responsive to them and not responsive to us. They're its funding mechanism instead of us being its funding mechanism. As alluded to before, this also siphons away power from the states. In the original blueprint, the states funded the feds. Now with a central bank printing up fiat currency from a magical printing press, the states are recipients of federal funds, utterly inverting the power dynamic. This gets even worse when you consider how they want to normalize welfare to the populace, calling it Universal Basic Income, or UBI for short. You hear a lot of the tech oligarchs promoting it. This is taxation in reverse. Instead of the citizen funding the government, now the government is funding the citizen. This is the classic master-slave relationship. To repeat, whoever pays out the silver is the master. In our original setup, we were the masters of the government. In the emerging system, the government is the master of the people. Step out of line and they shut off your money. Have the wrong political opinions and they starve you. This happened before in history. In England, in the Middle Ages, they had a proto-welfare system called the Poor Laws. Once beggars started to accept money from the state, they lost all their freedoms and were banished to the place of their birth, locked to a particular locality, like an open-air prison. Listen to Herbert Spencer talk about it here.
And yet to those who look into the records of the past not to revel in narratives of battles or to gloat over court scandals, but to find how institutions and laws have arisen and how they have worked, there is no truth more obvious than that generation after generation must pass before the outcome of an action that has been set up can be seen. Take the example furnished us by the Poor Laws. When vianage had passed away and serfs were no longer maintained by their owners, when in the absence of anyone to control and take care of serfs, there arose an increasing class of mendicants and sturdy rogues preferring robbery to labor. When in Richard II's time authority over such was given to justices and sheriffs, out of which there presently grew the binding of servants, laborers, and beggars to their respective localities, when, to meet the case of beggars impotent to serve, the people of the districts in which they were found were made in some measure responsible for them, so reintroducing into a more general form the feudal arrangement of attachment to the soil and reciprocal claim on the soil. It was not suspected that the foundations were laid for a system which would, in after times, bring about a demoralization threatening general ruin.
Conservatives talk about the modern welfare state. Now, the establishment wants people stuck in vote plantations. If you take the money, as the Poor Laws prove, you will have your freedoms restricted, your mobility curtailed, and your rights abrogated. You went from being a master to being a slave. Except your ghetto will be called a smart city, as Agenda 2030 outlines. This has all happened before. History is very instructive on what takes place after you take the silver. What was that Roman expression? You can either be a slave in chains of iron, or a slave in chains of silver. UBI is the chains of silver method. I leave you here with a quote from Reagan. Socialists ignore the side of man that is the spirit. They can provide you shelter, fill your belly with bacon and beans, treat you when you're ill. All the things guaranteed to a prisoner or a slave. By the way, I'm going to shill shamelessly and tell you about my book, Actionable Ethics. It's out. You can get it in either paperback or the audiobook format. You can find it on Amazon.com or any of the other retailers. Check it out if you get a chance. But more importantly, shilling aside, check out The New American magazine. It's at thenewamerican.com.